the most dangerous and most wanted man in Mexico, his capture valued at $15 million. It wasn't because of a drone. It wasn't because of a cell phone interception. He fell because of something much simpler, much more frightening. Two governments were looking for him, and more than that, no one could find him for 10 years. Until today, February 22nd, 2026. There are things that you know will happen sooner or later. And when they do happen, they can surprise you, even leave you speechless. Because one thing is knowing that something could happen someday, and it's a very different thing when that day is today. Let it be Sunday, early in the morning. Let it be there. Let it be lost among the mountains of Jalisco, which few people knew and today everyone knows. The world looks at the map. This story starts much earlier, much further back. It starts in a town that almost no one has in their heart mentioned, Michoacán, the place where a boy left school in 6th grade because his family had no other choice. That boy's name was Nemesio. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes. And that boy, the boy who picked avocados in the fields to help the family, the one who didn't finish primary school, the one who went north undocumented looking for something better. That boy became the most wanted man in Mexico, the man for whom the United States offered $15 million, 15 million letters, because sometimes numbers are not enough to understand what they mean. But wait, because before I tell you what happened this morning, before I tell you how all this ended, there are things you have to know. There are things people don't know about this man. There are things that don't appear in the newspapers. And there is something that happened in today's operation that I haven't wanted to tell you yet. Something that, if I tell you, changes everything, the way you understand everything you're listening to right now. So stay, because the most important part of this story is not what they found. The most important part is how they found him and what they found with him. And that tells the world about what this man really was. Beyond the name everyone knows, Naranjo de Chila, that's the name of the place, a small village in the municipality of Aguililla, Michoacán, one of those communities that exist on the map, but not for most people. They don't exist anywhere else. The land is dry, hard-working land where people get up before dawn and sleep with their bodies crushed. Nemesio was born there on July 17, 1966. He grew up in that community, saw his parents work, saw what absence is like, and like many young people from that region at that time, he decided to leave. He went north, to the States, undocumented, at a time when people were leaving, united in search of something, and what he found was not exactly what he was looking for. In California, still very young, he started selling drugs, small amounts, a business for those who had no other job, according to the logic of a man who had lived it from the inside. But they caught him. In 1992, he and his brother Abraham were arrested for selling heroin to 2 undercover police officers. We were sent to a federal prison in the U.S. Then they were deported. He returned to Mexico. And Mexico, for someone with that experience and nothing else, didn't have many open doors. Or, if they did, they weren't the doors he expected. If I knew what was on the other side, I would open it. He arrived in Tijuana. Tijuana in the 90s was a completely different world. It was a world with its own rules, its own owners, its own codes. And Nemesio learned those codes quickly, faster than most. he built connections, made a name. Then to Jalisco, and there he did something that still surprises those who study his history today. He joined the police forces, became a police officer in Tomatlan, a coastal municipality in Jalisco, and from inside the police, he learned how everything works, how those who are looking think, what the blind spots are, how mistakes are always made, how they commit. This information is invaluable, and he knew it. But wait, because there is something in this story that doesn't fit yet. There is something that those who knew them directly, those who speak with caution and half-truths, say that it was never just what it seemed, that there was a layer under the layer that everyone saw. And that layer is what is important to understand what happened tomorrow in the mountains of Jalisco. Don't say it yet, but stay, because that changes everything. You can tell me when Nemesio approached Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, the famous Nacho Coronel, things started to move differently. Nacho Coronel was a man with power, with connections, with territory, and he saw in Nemesio something worth using, something not common, a combination of coldness, tactical intelligence, and the ability to move in shadows that few have. When Nacho Colonel fell in July 2010, something happened that broke the existing order. But something also opened up, a space, a void. And Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, together with Eric Valencia Salazar, an 85-year-old man, decided that this place belonged to them. That's how the world later learned what it was. That's how it all started. And what started there didn't stop for years. It didn't stop despite governments saying it would stop. It didn't stop despite them putting a price on his head. It didn't stop even after they captured people close to him, including his own son, Ruben Gonzalez, El Menchito, arrested in 2015 and extradited to the United States years later. It didn't stop until this morning. There is something that researchers who have followed this story for years always say, that it was never just about how Mencho survived so long, not just because of his ruthlessness, but because of something even harder to combat, because of his paranoia, their discipline, because of the way he operated. This man trusted no one. And that's not an exaggeration. It was part of his method. It was part of what kept him alive, while others fell. I didn't use phones the way someone else used them. They didn't meet in one place. He didn't have just one hiding place. He moved. He was always moving. And when he stayed, he did it quietly, in places where no one else expected him to be quiet. The mountains of Jalisco were his shelter. Mountains, dirt roads that don't appear on any digital map, small communities where people either knew it or feared it, or both at the same time. Talpa de Allende. If you look for that name on the map, you'll find a municipality in the mountains, mainly from Jalisco, known for its religious sanctuary dedicated to the Virgin of Talpa, one of the 3 most important sanctuaries in Jalisco, a place of pilgrimages where people live, asking for miracles. But behind that image, for years that area was also Mencho's territory. He considered it his own. An area where I had eyes, I had ears. No one who shouldn't be there came without him knowing or thinking he knew. Stay with that for a moment. With that image. A man who built an entire protection system which turned the mountains into his walls, disappeared from all radar screens for years, escaped operations, survived information that came from inside his own ranks, a man who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. How does someone reach that level? Being human? Those who have worked on his pursuits for years ask themselves that question. And the answer, when it came, was not what anyone expected. It was not so big and noisy. It was something much smaller, much quieter. But still, I won't tell you, because there are parts of this story that you need to hear in order for them to make sense. This is what I'm telling you. There were people who were putting together the pieces for years, small pieces, movements, patterns, silences that say more than words, and they started to put together something slowly. 2021 was an important year in this story, although it didn't seem like it then. In November of that year, officials in Zapopan arrested Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, the wife of El Mencho, the woman who appeared next to him as a key part in the financial situation of the organization. A woman who, according to investigation data, dealt with money flows that investigators described as part of a structure parallel to everything visible. When they arrested her, however, Mencho did not react as analysts expected. There was no type of quick response seen in other similar situations. There was silence, a silence that some interpreted as indifference, but others, those who knew him better, interpreted it as something else, fear. Not the fear that paralyzes you, but the fear that makes you disappear even more from then on. The fear that makes you change everything, trust fewer people, move differently. And that retreat, that change in the way of moving, also leaves traces. Traces not easy to read, but someone who knows can continue to read them. Did they follow them? That's part of what led to today's operation. I can't tell you exactly yet, because there are parts of this puzzle that are still not understood, that need to be confirmed. But there is something that sources said, as they spoke this morning, and felt free to say. Today's operation was not improvised. It was not one of those that happened suddenly. It was expected for a long time. It was planned for a long time. Let's talk about what happened before dawn on February 22nd, 2026, Sunday. At dawn in the mountains of Jalisco, it's a place with its own language. The sounds of the countryside, the cold of the mountains, the roads at that time empty of everything except those who have reasons to be there. The Mexican army, together with other federal forces, moved towards the area of Talpa de Allende. It's not a small municipality in the area. It's the Sierra, it's Monte, it's territorial complex for any type of operation. And precisely because of that, that place had served as a refuge for so long. But this time, something was different. Something in the operation this morning was different from previous attempts and the like. They knew they were participating in it. They felt it in those operations when the level of processed information is different, when those who give orders speak in a different way, when the preparations are not the usual type, when people inside the operation notice it, feel it in the atmosphere. This morning felt like that. The initial reports that came out didn't speak directly about what had happened. They spoke of an operation, of force movements, of an area surrounded. They spoke of reactions that began to be recorded almost immediately. Roadblocks, vehicles set on fire in Jalisco, then in Michoacán, then in Colima, then in Guanajuato, then in Tamaulipas, then in Aguascalientes. In a few hours, 6 states. That's not something that happens by chance. That's something that happens when someone gives an order, when there is a structure waiting for that signal, receiving that signal. And what was the signal? What was it that caused the same situation in those 6 states? Were those reactions finally coordinated? No one wanted to say it yet this morning. Sources were speaking. They spoke on condition of anonymity. They spoke carefully. They spoke of a successful operation. They spoke of the security cabinet giving an official statement in the next few hours. But there was something in the way they spoke that meant more than just words. An official consulted by one of the most important media in the country answered a direct question with a few seconds of silence before speaking. And when he spoke, what he said was enough for the journalist who was talking, who understood what had happened in those mountains, was clear. Why the silence? Why pause before answering? Because confirming what happened was not just delivering news, it was like opening a door that once opened couldn't be closed. It was about starting a series of actions whose consequences those who took those decisions knew would be complex to manage. And they were right. The reactions in those 6 states demonstrated it in real time. Stop here for a moment, because before continuing, there is something I want you to keep in mind, something important to understand the rest of this story. When an organization like this loses whoever it is, what happens next? Then what happens? Then what happens follows a predictable script. It's not simple. It's not one day a leader, the next day none, and everything disappears. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way in similar cases. What happens is something much more complex and much more dangerous in feeling. There are cells that already exist operating in a semi-autonomous way years ago. There are figures that were waiting for a moment like this. There were internal rivalries that were limited by the existence of that name, of that figure, of that fear that name created. And when that name disappears, all the tensions that were reined in look for a way out. That is what security experts said this morning, that today is a very big blow, the biggest in Mexico in many years, but that the consequences will be complex, that the next work will be very difficult or more difficult than what led to this blow. But that's later. That's what's coming. For now, let's stop at what happened then in Talpa de Allende on that early morning in February, in that operation that had been planned for some time, and that this morning reached its end. There is the question everyone is asking today, the question journalists are asking, analysts are asking, people on social networks are asking, how did they find him? And that's the right question, because the answer to that question is the most important part of this story, the part I haven't told you yet, the part that changes the way you understand this man and everything that led to this moment. I'll tell you. I'll tell you in a few minutes. But first I want you to understand something about how this works, my friend, about how difficult it was to track him in the system he had built to stay invisible. Because without understanding that, the answer to that question won't seem as important as it is. Mencho understood what most people don't understand or don't want to understand about this situation. The technology you use to protect you today is the same one that betrays you tomorrow. And that made him distrust technology. Cell phones, modern communication systems, anything that depended on a signal that could be intercepted. In its place, he developed something older, slower, harder to penetrate. A network of human messengers who carried messages from one to another in confidence. A system that sacrificed communication speed, but gave him something even more valuable. invisibility. And that worked for years. The operations that arrived delayed. The information that always seemed to arrive after he had already moved. The feeling for those who pursued him of always being one step behind. But what happens when that system starts to crack? What happens when the chain starts to deviate from the path? What happens when, because of that, someone in that chain starts to speak differently? That's some things people don't know yet. And that's part of what I'm going to tell you. But not yet. There's still a way to go. Let's go back once more to Sunday morning. Let's go back to Jalisco. Governor Pablo Lemus activated the security table before the sun rose. He ends up leaving. That's important. That's what the state was talking about at that time. The blockades were not in just one place, but in several municipalities at the same time. The roads closed, vehicles in flames, people who couldn't leave their homes. Lemus asked for calm. He asked people to follow official channels, not to expose themselves, to have patience. Words that are said when situations are serious, and when the situation on the ground is still in motion. Michoacán activated its own protocols. Governor Alfredo Ramirez also put his security table, and soon the ruthless reactions reached Colima, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, Aguascalientes hot, a chain of reactions in 6 states, coordinated at the same time in its impact, even if not in its origin, as if someone had sent a precise signal and everyone had responded at the same time. And in the midst of all this, the federal authority was keeping an official silence. They were speaking informally to the media, under condition of anonymity, but the official statement, the one that was going to confirm everything to the public, the official one, hadn't arrived yet. Why the official silence? How long does it take in such a situation? There can be several reasons. One of them is verification, to fully confirm that the person who died in that operation was who he said he was. That takes time. It requires procedures. It's not advertised something like that without full insurance. But there is another reason. A reason related to what they found with him, with the things that came out of that operation, in addition to the main result. And so, I'll tell you, but first, let me finish telling you who this man was, because if you know him only through what the newspapers say about him, you're missing something. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes created something that went much further than any organization that had built something similar in Mexico before. It wasn't just a distribution network, it wasn't just control of territory, it was something more like a parallel state with its own logic, with its own economy, with its own informal justice system that people followed in those territories and knew very well. The organization he led became what U.S. officials described as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. From Mexico, from the world. And when the administration of President Donald Trump designated the organization as a foreign terrorist organization, it was not just a symbolic statement, it was a recognition of what it meant in terms of organized crime language that was no longer sufficient to describe traditionally. Terrorism. They used that word, and that has very important consequences in terms of how it can be pursued, how that pursuit can be financed, what international collaboration can be mobilized. The DEA had him on the most wanted list, $15 million. That was the reward from the Department of the United States that offered for information leading to his capture, or $15 million to process. An amount that says something about this man's priority level for that government, more than a powerful man in the world. Mexican officials also offered a reward, 30 million pesos for information leading to his capture. 2 governments, 2 intelligence systems, 2 security apparatuses with enormous resources, pursued for years, and yet nothing until this morning. What changed? That's the question. That's the central question of this history, and we're getting to the point where I can start telling you the answer, not all at once, because the answer has layers too. There are parts that are better understood if they are heard in a certain order. But we've arrived. We've almost arrived. Because what happened today in Talpa de Allende didn't start early in the morning in Talpa de Allende, it started much earlier, at a point that few people would have imagined. And that point has to do with something Mencho never thought would be his weak point. He never trusted technology, but if he trusted people. And people, unlike technology, have their fears, they have families, they have limits, they have moments where they know the weight of what could happen to them if they speak is heavier than that fear. There was someone who spoke. I can't tell you who, not because they didn't want to, but because honestly, it's not yet publicly confirmed. But it's clear what the investigators involved in this case alluded to in their conversations with the media that will come out. The information that allowed the operation this morning did not come from a technological breakthrough. It didn't come from a drone. It didn't come from a satellite. It came from inside. Keep that for a minute, because it's important. A man who built his system to protect himself from distrust, who feared an interview more than any cell phone that would carry out any operation, had survived precisely for years because he minimized the number of people he trusted. A man, with all that system, all the paranoia built as a shield, was hit because of something he couldn't control. Loyalty also has limits. It always has a limit. And when that limit is broken in the right way, at the right time, with the right person right, everything else stops being a matter. Walls, roads, land, mountains, human messengers, alternative communication systems. All that is of little use when there is someone who knows exactly where you are and decides to say it. The previous operations arrived delayed because the information arrived delayed. This time, the information arrived on time. That's the difference. That's the difference that makes this story end as it ends. And what happened when the army arrived at that point in the mountains of Jalisco, the mountainous area of Talpa de Allende, before sunrise this Sunday? I still need to tell you in more detail, because that's where the part no one expected is, the part that made the officials who spoke to the media this morning speak with that pause, with that silence before answering. But before we get there, I have to tell you something about this man's last years, about what happened to him after he lost people close to him, after his son was captured, after his wife was arrested, after the organization he built began to face many pressures on fronts at the same time, because there is the image that most people have of Mencho as a powerful, untouchable man who gives orders and is obeyed, who appears in threatening videos to other organizations, to authorities, to the government. That image existed. It was real at one time, but according to the last years, their close trace drew something different. A man who could no longer trust the same people as always because those people had changed, they had been captured, he had disappeared. A man with health problems that reports had said for some years. According to some, diabetes that had fallen on part of a foot, that made him dependent on medications and medical care that was very difficult to obtain while hiding in the mountains. In short, a man still powerful because the structure he had built represented him. But physically, from a human point of view, I was paying the price of living like that for decades. That makes him less dangerous. No, not at all. These organizations create things that don't disappear with him. The semi-autonomous cells that operated are still there. The networks he wove are still there. But it makes the image of an untouchable man, a man who seemed to exceed the reach of any operation, whether that image was always partly false, because no one is really out of reach of everything. No one. And that brings us back to the early morning in the mountains. What happened? The operation was coordinated with the participation of the Mexican Army other federal forces. The areas of the mountain ranges of Talpa de Allende, identified as an area of activity of the organization, the main objective was the arrival of the location planned at a level of detailed information that previous operations had not been. High-level sources within the Cabinet of Ministers' Security confirmed it to several media, not just one, but several. And they all said the same thing. The operation was carried out as a result. Everyone understood that they were announcing it. Although no one said it with those words, however, the governor of Jalisco activated the Red Code in the state. That's not something that's done for any reason. Red Code is the highest alert level. That's the official recognition that the situation in the area is serious and the need for resources and coordination at the highest level and the reactions in those 6 states. Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, and Aguascalientes continued to develop while all this was happening. Vehicles fires, closed roads, affected businesses, people who couldn't move. The reflection of many they expected such a reaction when that day came. Not relief, but a wave of coordinated disorders that showed that the organization, although wounded in a way never before wounded, was still capable of responding. And now you really want me to tell you what you're still missing. What they found him in that place in the mountains with Nemesio, or Oseguera, from Jalisco Cervantes. It wasn't just what I expected to find in a hiding place of a man who had been moving for years saw. There was something else, something that the officials who confirmed the message alluded to, something related to the real scope of what this man was driving. Not in terms of abstract assessment, not in terms of political power or distribution routes. In very concrete terms, materials, documents, data, the type of information that, when in the hands of officials, changes an investigation, not only about him, but about others, about connections, about names, about flows, about things this man knew and how far his knowledge extended, because that has always been the most difficult issue. Difficult to understand outside. El Mencho was not just an operator, such a man. He accumulated information for decades, information about people, about institutions, about agreements that exist in the world of shadows he operated. And that information, now in other hands, is what investigators will spend the next few months analyzing. That can start investigations that don't exist yet. That can confirm suspicions that until today were just that. Suspicions. That's the real impact of what happened this morning. Not just the fall of a name, but the opening of everything that name protected with silence. There is something most important. It's to tell how the Army got there to that place. The protocols activated identification. After the operation, they were not improvised. Those protocols were designed for that moment specifically, to avoid what happened in other similar situations in past experiences. Doubt, the possibility of error, the question the world gives if it is announced, and then it turns out he is not the person he said he was. That took time. That's why the official statement at that time the operation had not yet been carried out arrived, because those who manage types of situations know that confirmation has to be reliable. It has to be that precise, because the cost of an error in such an advertisement would be very large, and confirmation came. It came informally, first from high-level sources who spoke with several tools, and then the official process continued. $15 million. That was the reward that had been talked about for years about this man. $15 million that someone somewhere this point in the chain allowed them to win. Not in the sense literally someone wants to charge the check, although that could also happen, but in the sense that someone took the step that created everything, if something else was possible, and that someone, whoever it was, didn't do it, it must have been easy. Why live in that world and decide to speak is not something that is done without consequences, not something done without knowing there is a price that is not money. Let's go back this time to the streets of Jalisco tomorrow. The forces of security controlled the blockades, while the governor spoke of Code Red, while in 6 states the reports of disorder began to come one after another. Something else was happening quieter. The people, the common people, those who live in those regions for years, they knew one thing: he existed in those mountains, although they never had to say it out loud. People who lived in the shadow of a name that to some extent was not pronounced in contexts ahead, not mentioned as an active presence of some people who never, even if it was visible. How are those people feeling today? That's a question without an answer, just so that it doesn't seem like only one thing is felt at a time, and that some of those things are contradictory. Some people feel that something is over, a weight that he named it, but it was loaded. It disappeared, at least partially now. There is no that figure representing something in those communities that was known close. Some people feel fear of what comes next, because in these territories, when something changes in the order of power, the next period is not always calmer. Sometimes it is certainly more dangerous, because the vacuum attracts those who want to fill it, and those who want to fill it, but not always more softly than the previous one. And there are people who simply don't know what to feel yet, who are processing, who are waiting for what happens next in the days to learn how to interpret this moment. These 3 types of response exist today in Jalisco, in Michoacán, in Aguililla, the place where he was born, in places where his name is well known. Now let's return to the question that interests most people, which is important to understand the future. The question of security analysts. They are answering everything today, the media. What next? The question that is most important in understanding the future. The question of analysts, security, is answering today all the media. And that question, simple people. People who live in those states, in those municipalities, in those mountain communities also, he is doing it, but with an important difference. When the analyst does it, he does it from the outside, from a desk taken from a television studio. When someone does it who lives in Talpa de Allende or Aguililla, or in one of the municipalities of Colima that woke up with blocked roads at dawn, the question has another weight, because for that person, that question is not academic. It's a matter of daily life. whether I can go out tomorrow or not, of if my children arrive safely at school, whether I can open the business I have or not. Everything is fine. And that difference is important. It's very important to understand why these stories don't end with operational. Because the next day is always more complex than it seems from the outside. Organizations similar to the one Mencho led don't work like if it were a CEO. A company disappears, everything stops. I've said it before, but it's worth staying longer on it in time. It's worth understanding that when Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, was captured and later extradited to the United States, many people thought that it would change the landscape in a certain radically and quickly. And yes, the panorama changed, but not as most people expected. What happened next was fragmentation, the dispersion of power that was previously concentrated, and paradoxically, that dispersion made things in many regions of the country not easier, but more difficult, because, in place of a structure with internal logic, with hierarchies and certain hidden agreements about where the boundaries are, what remained was a map of smaller groups, less predictable, more willing to use violence, because they didn't have the same possibility of the existence of the original structure stopping it. Now the same will happen. The fall of Mencho leads to a similar process. Experts they spoke today and couldn't agree on an answer. Some say yes, the pattern can repeat itself, that inside the organization there are figures already fighting for places of power in recent years, that the fragmentation process had already begun before today, and that tomorrow this only accelerates it. Others say that this situation is different, that the organization Mencho built had a more centralized structure than others, that it depended more on his personal figure, on his presence as a factor of unity carried out by other similar organizations, and therefore his fall can affect the number faster and more destabilizing deep. Both groups are sure of what will happen, because these things can't be predicted precisely. They depend on too many variables: who takes the first step, how the information makes a difference, current status of the group's organization, what alliances exist, and of those alliances which ones are maintained, and which ones break when the name that kept it no longer exists. That's what the Mexican state has to prepare to manage this process, and the information obtained from the operation today, what was found in the mountains, now in fashion analyzed, that will be at the center of the preparation. There is something that international media players stand out a lot in the next few hours and days. Something related to the political context where this operation was carried out. The relations between Mexico and the states united in security matters have gone through difficult times in recent years. Tensions over collaboration, over the level of access that U.S. agencies had in Mexican territory, over the terms of that collaboration, borders of sovereignty and borders of international pressure. And yet, in this operation, as a result this morning, there is something that, despite all those tensions, the collaboration continued at the levels where it matters most, because the intelligence information that allowed reaching this point is not something that happens by itself. From the inside, that requires collaboration. It requires sharing information. It requires that there are channels that work even when diplomatic relations on the surface are complex. The DEA has been documenting this man for years, creating a file one of the most detailed that exists on any person in organized crime on the continent. And that file, that whole collection of information years, was part of what made today's operation possible. Does that give credit for joint work? It's a sign of collaboration in this matter that is worth more than political tensions depending on the situation. They will want to say that officials from both countries in the next few hours that this result shows that collaboration is effective, that there are things that can only be achieved when both sides of the border work in the same direction. And they may be right, or history may be even more complex. Maybe there are parts of how this point came about that won't appear in any official statement, that will remain in private conversations, in classified files, in testimonies according to, if they ever happen, they will be in a very different context from a press conference. That's also part of how these stories work. The official version and the full versions are not always the same thing. But let's go back to what I mentioned before, and I want to develop it after because I think it's important. I think the most important part of this story is that it can easily get lost in the middle of operations, statements, and geopolitical analysis. The blockades that happened in 6 states in the hours after the operation, they were not just an operational response of the organization. They were not just a demonstration of capabilities. They were also something more human and even more terrifying. They were people, people who are members of the royal family, who receive orders, who obey, who go out to block roads, to burn vehicles, to create disorders in the communities they live in. Nothing to do with any of this. Who are they? People? What drives them to obey those orders? Place moment? That's a question that never finds an answer. It achieves good results in security analysis, because analysis security treats these people as actors in the equation, like pieces on a board. And they are not. They are people with stories, with contexts, with reasons that led them to be there, which are complex and don't fit into a simple category. Some are there because they have no other options, or because they believe so. Some are there because fear was stronger than any other consideration. Some are there because, at some point in their lives, they made a decision that led them to that point, that they certainly would have seen at the beginning, where it was going to take them. And some are there because they believed in something, in an order, in a structure, in a logic of belonging that offered something that other things didn't offer. Offered identification, purpose, place in the world. This is not an excuse. It's not justification. The damage they cause is real. The consequences of their actions are real. But if someone wants to understand why these things exist, they continue, why they don't disappear when a figure falls, they have to be willing to look at those parts too. Talpa de Allende has an image of Jalisco, and Mexico's imaginary completely different from the one we have today in the newspaper headlines. It has tradition, faith. The Virgin of Talpa is one of the 3 virgin girls of Jalisco's holy places. Pilgrims make long pilgrimages on foot, sometimes lasting several days. People from many parts of the state, from the country, fulfilling promises, giving thanks, asking for miracles at the time. This municipality headquarters, place of sanctuary, that's the place where this morning happened one of the most important operations in Mexico's recent history. That contrast means something. I don't know exactly what, but it says something about how in the same territory contradictory things coexist. Faith and fear, traditions and violence, they have traveled paths whose name is not mentioned. Pilgrims and dirt roads that don't appear on any map, and only those who have reasons to know them to meet them. Mexico is full of such contradictions. places that have two things at the same time, parallel stories going on. One that is said out loud, and another that exists in the silence of those who know what they say. And what happened this morning in Talpa de Allende is also part of a longer history, which is not only about this man, but about what has been in Mexico for these decades, that these powers grew until they became what they became. A data appears on the pages of files, and it's worth mentioning because it says a lot about the scale of what this man represented. The United States offered $15 million for him dollars. The Department of the United States Treasury had it authorized. His assets in that country, those that could be identified, were frozen. There were restrictions on travel in several places, alerts were in international systems, but at the same time, the organization he led continued to operate, continued to grow in some areas. He continued to produce money flows that investigators described with figures that were difficult to imagine in their real precision. As is that possible? How can something exist like that facing all the apparatuses of persecution? The answer has several layers. One of them is geography. The mountain ranges of Mexico are a preferred territory for those who want to hide from whom. They are enormous. They are difficult to monitor completely. They have communities that live with their own logics far from the government systems that operate in urban areas. Another layer is corruption, not as an abstract incident, but as something very concrete. People in positions of authority who looked the other way in exchange for something, who leaked information, who warned about operations, who carried out, probably. A person remained invisible within the system that was looking for him, they said. How many times did the information arrive delayed, because someone sent it deliberately delayed? How many operations failed not because of bad intelligence, but because someone inside the system had warned in advance that the operation reached his destination? These are questions without answers that are still public, but that have been part of the real history, a story that goes beyond what is said in statements. And that may be part of what they found in today's operation, part of the information I mentioned earlier, exactly what to do with, who worked with whom, when, with parallel protection system, which was not just the mountain range, it was not just human messengers. They were also institutional dimension, which is harder to talk about out loud. Let's leave it. Now let's talk about something important in this story. Something that needs time over time. This man was active for more than 3 decades. 3 decades that Mexico has also been changing, in which governments were changing, in which international relations were changing, in which technology changed, in which the world changed and he changed with that world. That's something those who studied him stood out constantly. He was not a static operator. He was a man who learned, who adapted his methods so that when something stopped working, I was looking for something different. That had started when cell phones didn't exist or were very rare. He operated during the explosion of digital communication. During the era of development of drones, it was the era of surveillance systems that previously existed, science fiction. And at each stage, he adapted his methods to remain invisible within each new technological context. That requires intelligence, not the kind that is measured in the living room developing classes, the kind that develops in practice, in observation, in the ability to read the environment and understand what makes you vulnerable at each moment. A man who left school in 6th grade, who didn't finish primary school, and without, however, he created a system that allowed him to remain invisible in front of two apparatuses more complex intelligence on the planet for more than a decade. That's not about whether what he did was right or wrong. It's not about ambiguity there is, but not about what kind of intelligence exists outside formal systems, about what capabilities develop in contexts that never had to produce such things product. But there is something else in this story I haven't told you at all. Something related to the people closest to him, with family. When we think about this type of stories, family appears in a very particular way, as an extension of power, as a control tool, as part of the structure. And partly that's true. There are members of Mencho's family who were involved in the activity of the organization. That's documented. His son, Ruben Gonzalez El Menchito, was captured in 2015 and extradited to the United States years later. His wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, was arrested in 2021. There are brothers and sisters who appear in the files, but there is another reality, one that doesn't appear in the files, one of those who were born. They didn't choose to be in that context without the possibility of choosing which family to be born into. What about them? People today? What does what happened this morning mean to them? Those are questions no one can answer in a government statement that probably never will be public, but they exist. They are part of this story, even if they don't appear in the headlines. And speaking of things that don't appear in headlines, there are communities in Jalisco and other cities that have lived for years in Michoacán under the shadow of the organization that this man led, represented their territory. Communities where the presence was usual, where the organization provided things that the state didn't provide. It didn't provide employment or local security according to its own logic, decision conflicts in its own way, support when need arose, economy parallel. In those communities it wasn't parallel because it was the only one that existed. That's a phenomenon that academics and politicians prefer not to talk much about, because talking about it requires recognizing that there are parts of the national territory where the state really didn't arrive, not effectively, not in a way that radically changes the living conditions of people, and in that void, other logics grow, other structures they establish, and once established, they are very difficult to replace with something different, because that something different doesn't exist yet. What happens in those communities today? What happens when the structure that provided certain things in the way it provided them before no longer exists? That structure wasn't good, but it was something. And when something that was there is lost without something to replace it, a real void can be very difficult to live as before. That's what those who work in development community, in peace and security, in state building in weak territories, they have been saying it for years that operations are necessary but not sufficient. That behind each successful operation requires a plan for what comes next. From what institutions that territory comes from, what services, what real state presence, and sustained over time. Without that, the cycle continues under different names, with different forms, but with the same basic logic. Let's go back one more time to the mountains. That Sunday, early in the morning today, there is something that reports highlighted briefly, and that deserves more attention. The level of preparation of the logistics of the operation in Talpa de Allende, access to it, is not easy. It's not a place easily accessible without deploying large amounts of forces without note. The roads are difficult. The terrain is irregular. The people who live there know the surroundings and notice when something different is happening. That means that the logistics of this operation that morning had to be extremely careful. The movement of forces had to be carried out in a way that didn't raise alarm, that didn't arrive before the scheduled time people who could warn, who didn't activate alert systems that man had built there for years' territory. How is that achieved? How is the deployment carried out? Important military forces towards this point of existence in the mountains without noticing until it's too late. Why should that be important? That requires coordination at the highest level, requires compartmentalization of information. That those who know what is going to happen are precisely those fewer possible, who disguise their actions as something else until they reach the point of no return, and requires information intelligence so precise that the margin of error is minimal. Because in that type of terrain, with that type of terrain objective, an operation that arrives 10 minutes delayed can be an operation that arrives too late. This time, it didn't arrive late. This time the information was precise, and the execution matched the quality of that information. It was that. That makes this operation something different from the previous ones. Not only in the result, in the process that led to the result. I want to talk about something that seems important, and it's related to memory, with how we will remember this day in 10 years, in 20. Some events happen, they seem like the end of something, and that time passes. They are seen as the beginning of something else. A turning point that marked a before and after, even if at the moment they happened, it wasn't entirely clear what would happen next. Is this one of those events? It could be. In 10 years, those who read or study Mexico look at February 22nd, 2026, as one of those moments, as a day in which something changed unexpectedly in the map of criminal power in the country. But it could also be, let's see, that it's so complex that the turning point blurs, that the fragmentation after this fall creates new dynamics more difficult to manage, then the operation today just became another chapter in a longer story that still doesn't have its visible end. We don't know yet. No one knows today, because the consequences of a phenomenon like these are seen over time, in what happens in the coming months, how the remaining structures respond, in how the state responds, with what decisions are made based on the information obtained. We know that today something happened, I couldn't get away with it, that it will have consequences, that it moves the board significantly, and that the subsequent work consists of a volume that requires adapting to the task what this operation means. There is the last thing I want to tell you before closing this story. Something related to numbers, figures. For years, the name of El Mencho appeared related to numbers that were difficult to imagine in their particular reality. Tons of drugs, millions of dollars, number of transactions, number of territories under control, number of people involved in the structure. Those numbers are important to understand the scale, but at the same time, they can miss what makes everything visible abstract, a problem on too large a scale, a sociological phenomenon, a statistic, and it's not, it never was. Behind each number, there are people. People who consumed what the organization distributed, people who live in the previous communities affected by what this organization did in its territory. People who worked inside that organization for complex reasons, and I don't know, that can be summarized in one word. People in institutions who looked the other way, or actively participated in making all this exist for so long, and people who worked for years until the day arrived when it reached. People in the Army, in the Navy, in intelligence agencies, in research groups who compiled files, who followed clues that put together parts that endured for years without results coming out, who continued to work even though previous operations arrived delayed. Those people are also part of the history, the least visible part in headlines. The sun finished rising over the mountains of Jalisco, over Talpa de Allende, over Rhodes land that was no longer the same that is. They did it 24 hours ago. The blockades in 6 states they began to be lifted during the course, slow, careful, because although the direct cause of those reactions was neutralized, the situation in the area remained delicate. It was still a moment that required careful handling. Statement: the federal government official arrived, confirmed what sources informal had already reported. The confirmed with the official language of government statements, with names right, with confirmed data, and the world reacted as the world reacts to this type of news. International media, the event was disseminated by news agencies. That message was disseminated by governments who had an interest in this work. They published their statements. The DEA spoke out. The State Department spoke in a place where silence reigned again, as it always has. At sunrise it continued over trees and Rhodes land, as every day, no matter what below. Naranjo de Chila, Michoacán. 78 years of the story that began in an avocado field and ended in a mountain range of roads that don't appear on maps. Nemesio Rubeno, blindness Cervantes. El Mencho, the most wanted man in Mexico in several decades, neutralized in the first Sunday work time, February 22nd, 2026. And what remains, what always remains, is the question without answer in a statement, the consequences that will develop in the coming months, information analyzed, names that will appear in that information, investigations that will open, and communities, people who lived in that shadow, and today also they fear all this, and what comes next, they breathe differently. That's also part of this story, the longest part, that doesn't end today, barely there begun.